In this video, I'll demonstrate connecting Visual Studio Community Edition 2022 to GitHub. I'm only going to cover a couple of the very basic things you can do with GitHub. I'm not going to cover some of the things that you would get into if you were working on a team or using GitHub for a professional project. This will mainly let you work with your personal projects where you're the only developer who's working on them. To start out, I will assume that you've gone to github.com and created an account there. I've created one here called Coding with Scott. Once you create your account, your URL will be github.com/ whatever your username is, and that's where all of your repositories will be. And your repositories are just copies of your source code. The first thing we'll do is create a new project in Visual Studio and then push that up to our GitHub repository. If we go into GitHub and look at my repositories, we see that I have two of them here. These are ones that I've already created. Once we create the new project, we'll see our third project up here. I'll start by going into Visual Studio, click Create a New Project, and I'm going to pick a console app. It really doesn't matter. This is just a test application. And I will call this my GitHub test project. And I'll change the location over to my E drive and my projects folder, just because that's how I like to keep my projects in one place on my local computer. Go to the next. Select .NET 6. Again, this doesn't matter. This will work for any type of project. And now I've created the project. In the upper right section of Visual Studio, we have the Solution Explorer area. And at the bottom, we have Git Changes. If we click on that, this is where we'll work with Git in the future. Right now, we haven't connected to anything, so we just have these two buttons. But we're going to now push this project to GitHub. The way I like to do this is down at the bottom right of Visual Studio, we have this little text that says Add to Source Control. So I left click on that, and it shows me Git as the source control tool. So I'll click on that, and now it shows me Create a Git repository here in the middle screen. This is where I create the information about the repository, the copy of the source code I'm going to save on GitHub. I've got my local path to the project. The second thing here is a git ignore template, which is set to default. Since I'm working with Visual Studio, I'll click this and scroll down and select Visual Studio. So the git ignore template, this is the files that we have on our local computer that we don't need to push to GitHub. And this would be things like my user configuration. Also, once I build this solution, in fact, let's do that. I'm going to cancel out of here and do a quick build. If we look in our directory now, we see I've got a bin folder and an OBJ folder, and these are kind of the compiled versions of our program. We don't need these in GitHub. We really just need the source code. In this case, the CS project file and the CS file. So the Visual Studio, if we go back into here, by selecting the Visual Studio git ignore template, we tell GitHub when we push our code to GitHub, don't push the bin folder, the OBJ folder, our user, our specific user settings, things like that. Next, we need to go to the account. And on the first time you do this, you're going to need to sign in. So I'll click the sign in, and I'm going to add an account for GitHub. It pops up into a browser page, and it should authorize you here if you're already logged into GitHub. If you're not, you may need to log in and give permission to Visual Studio. So I'll close that tab. And we see now the owner, it has my Coding with Scott GitHub account. It has the repository name, which is usually the solution name, so we'll just leave that. You can enter a description here if you want. And then an important thing here is the checkbox for private repository. If this is checked, once you push your code to GitHub, you'll be the only person who can see that code. If you uncheck this, that makes it a public repository. So that means anybody who goes to GitHub can see your code. You might want to start out with just doing private repositories. One potential problem you may run into the first time you start using source control is you may have passwords or keys or something that you need to keep private. And if you uncheck this box and make your repository public, then anybody can see your passwords and keys. So until you learn how to manage those, the best, safest thing is to just make this a private repository. And then we see down here it says push your code to GitHub, and it gives you the URL for where this repository will be. In this case, it's github.com/whatever your GitHub username is /whatever your repository name is. And that's the one we entered up here in the repository name text box. So I'll click Create and Push. And if you notice in the upper right, now that we've logged in, we've got a different screen for our Git changes. We have a message here that says configure your username and email address before committing changes. And then we've got a message that the Git repository was created. So I'm going to click on the configure your username and email address. And this is just a Visual Studio thing. I just go with the default here and set this in my global git config. So now this will be the username and email address Visual Studio uses for anything it pushes to GitHub, at least on this computer. So I'll save that. And if we go back to GitHub and go into my Coding with Scott and refresh, we see I now have 3 repositories with the My GitHub Test project added. I can click on that, and we see here's my solution file, here's my gitignore file, here's a folder for the actual project, and if I click on that, we see here's my CS project file and my program.cs. And we can even click on this and see the source code inside the program.cs file. Now let's say I want to make a change to my project. So I'll go into here, I'll just make a very simple change. I'll change the console write line hello world to hello Scott. And I'll save that. If you notice over here in the Git Changes, we now see under this Changes line, program.cs has changed. It's listed there. I can right-click on this and say Compare with Unmodified, and I'll see over here on the left in Visual Studio is the original code, the unmodified code, and over here on the right is the modified code with the change I made highlighted. If I want to push this to GitHub, I will probably enter a message here. In fact, it's required, so I'm going to say changed name. Try to make your GitHub commit messages meaningful. It's better than just typing random letters. If you ever go back and look at your history, then you'll know what you did in that particular set of changes. So now we have this Commit All button. I'm going to click the drop down to the right of it, and I'm going to say Commit All and Push. In the future, I'll create a more in-depth GitHub and Git tutorial video, and maybe even a series. But right now, the important thing is if you commit your changes, you're just doing that locally on your computer. If you commit and push, then you're saying take my changes and push them up to GitHub. So we'll do that, commit and push, and I get a message here that successfully pushed to origin master, and I get an option to create a pull request. Again, that's one of the more advanced things that you might do on a team. Right now we're not going to do pull requests, so I'll just close that message. But now if I go to GitHub and refresh, we notice that the source code for program.cs says hello Scott now. So it has our change. As I mentioned at the start, I'm not going to get too in-depth into everything you can do on GitHub, but I know a lot of times people are going through some of my guides and they have questions and they want me to look at their source code, so I'm going to show you how to share your code with me or with anyone on GitHub. So let's say I go back up here to my project. I'm going to click on the settings, and there's an option over here on the left called collaborators. I'll click that, and I need to enter in my password here very quickly. GitHub wants to make sure I'm actually the person who has permissions to give other people permissions. We'll confirm that password, and now I can manage the access. I'm going to add a person here, and I can search by someone by their GitHub username, their full name, or their email. In this case, I'm going to invite my main account and add Scott Lilly to this repository. So now my other main account in GitHub is going to be able to access this project, even though it's a private project. Now it's private to everyone in the world except for Coding with Scott user and Scott Lilly user. This will send out an invitation, and then I have to go into my email or go into my other account and accept the invitation before I fully have permissions. But this is how you would share one of your private repositories with someone else on GitHub. Next, I'll demonstrate how to pull down someone else's public repository. So we'll go back to my main page here, and we'll close Visual Studio, and I'll go into my projects folder on my E drive. If you notice, I just have the one My GitHub test project, the one that we just created. But let's say I wanted to go to one of my Scott Lilly projects. So I'll check my repositories out here, and let's say I want to get this Wordo program. I'll click on the repository, and if you click on this green code button, you'll see here is the URL you need if you want to clone the repository. So this is the location of the repository. And you can click over here on the right to copy to the clipboard. Now when I open Visual Studio, one of the options is clone a repository. I'll click on that this time, enter in or paste in that URL that we just got. Select the path that I want to put this, and I'll put this in my E projects folder and add the name of the project. So this will create a new E projects Wordo, which is the name of the game I have on my repository. It will create that folder, and it will pull down the source code for the project from here. Then I click the clone button. And this is a small project, so it clones it pretty quickly. If we go look at our directories, we see I now have a Wordo folder with the solution and the different projects and the different classes that were all pulled down from my Scott Lilly Wordo repository. And if I look in the Solution Explorer, here's the files. For some reason it opens it up in this particular format. I like to view it in the solution format, so I double click on solution, and now it shows it in kind of the standard way I'm used to seeing it. So now I have all the source code from this public project out here on GitHub. And now I can build it locally, change it around. You could potentially make changes to it and attempt to push it to my repository, but then we get into some of the more advanced features of GitHub. For right now, you would just use this if you see someone's code on GitHub that you want to pull down and build locally and test with and maybe modify locally. And that's it for this video. Now you should be able to connect your Visual Studio Community Edition 2022 to your GitHub account. You should be able to push changes from your project into a repository on GitHub. And you should be able to pull down public repositories that other people have posted on GitHub so that you can test their programs locally. If you have any questions, please leave them beneath the video and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible.